Managers of Reddit, what's the fastest you've had to fire a new hire? Hired this big Michael Clark Duncan looking guy who claimed he had experience in a kitchen, had some higher end stuff on there, and talked the talk well. Nobody could get a hold of his references, but we were short and needed a body and he'd interviewed really well. Cut to his first day. The man has no clue at all about any of the big kitchen basics, and we start questioning our decision. But we figure maybe he's nervous or hungover. It is a kitchen after all, and we let it ride another day. Day 2. He comes in and starts prepping, and I'm keeping half an eye on him. I see him grab some potatoes for soup, and next thing you know, he mutters about the chef's knife being dull, and instead of sharpening it with the whetstone on hand, or even using a steel, he grabs a 10-inch flexible Bonner, it's a knife, it's not that kind of story, and starts wobbling and forcing his way through a large russet. It's not going well. I pipe up, hey, that's the wrong tool for the job. What the hell are you doing? He says, nah, man, I got this. As I try protesting again, to tell him no dude, seriously, you are going to bleed. I see the potato roll out of his grip, and the knife spring off of the side of it, and sink itself into his left hand, and out the backside. I'd never seen a black dude go pale before that day, but he sure did. I then proceeded to tell him we were going to the hospital, leave it in, and I'll grab a towel. This guy yanks the blade out of his hand and covers my prep table, slicer, and wall with blood in the process. I handed him the towel, he wraps up, and tells me he's good to drive to the hospital, and would be back as soon as he could. I told him he didn't need to come back until the next day to pick up his paycheck. He freaks out, and I have to call him on his BS and list about a dozen unsafe or unhygienic practices that are enough to cause me to let him go, let alone the fact that he just stuck a knife through his frigging hand after being told not to use it. You can lie your way into a lot of jobs, but you can't lie your way into a kitchen. TLDR. Fired a guy on his second day for ramming a boning knife through his hand like a dummy after trying to cut potatoes with it and being told that it was the wrong tool for the job. I worked at a boarding kennel for a few years and really loved it. It's hard, loud, dirty work, but I like animals and dogs are the best people. We also boarded exotics, which was neat as hell. Anyway, the boss hires on this gal that seemed a little off. During training she'd stare off into space and not really acknowledge me, but when I walked her through the process of feeding and cleaning kennels she did it just fine. So I set her on her way. Her first real day of work she went out to clean the kennels, scoop up and wet bedding and replace it. This is a long process. Takes 2 hours if you really know the work. Well, 6 hours into her shift no one has seen her. So I go hunting, and easily half the kennels are done, and a lot of doors are open. For dog safety you just don't do that. Now I can't find the girl or 4 of the dogs. I run to the boss, because I genuinely thought this girl had stolen someone's pets, and the whole team goes looking for her. We knew the boss found her, because she's a screamer. She's got these 4 big dogs, a Malamute, a Great Dane and 2 Shepherds, all on leashes, tied to the fence, and she's giving them baths in the owner's horse trough. We don't groom. She brought the shampoo from home in her lunchbox. She didn't understand why the boss was mad. It's so hot, and they looked so unhappy. Look at how happy the other 10 I already did are. The boss literally dragged her to her car kicking and screaming because we abuse dogs. So, yeah, 6 hours. In total, about 63 minutes of on the clock time. Manager at a vegan spot in New York City in the past. Girl was so nice and motivated during interview, gave me great vibes, and was excited to bring her on. Very first day she's 4 hours late to her 5 hours training shift. She said she overslept. Her shift started 5 PM on a Tuesday. Lots of red flags, but I'm a nice guy, and she said she needed the money and it'd never happen again. Literally the next day she comes in 2 hours late and drunk. The first words out of her mouth were not an excuse or an apology or anything. She asks me, can I get $100 upfront from my first check after my shift so I can go out with my girl tonight? It's her birthday. I didn't even fire her. I just banned her from ever coming back. Edit. A word for grammar. Edit 2. Decided to throw this unrelated side story in just for laughs, but it continues on from that day with her. I do freelance photography and am fairly popular on social media. Easy to guess name. I primarily photograph women, fashion/nude/portraits, and the first day she comes, a little after she came in late, she notices my camera by the lockers. She inquires about my Instagram and follows me. She's fairly pretty and had asked me if I'd ever be photograph her. I didn't really give her an answer, but didn't say no. Fast forward to the week after I fired her, she had already came in and picked up whatever cash she made training. She messages me on Instagram to take photos at around 10 PM around the city. If I had nothing to do, it was a little weird since I fired her, but she was pretty and I was off of work that night/following day. It was my most frustrating and worst photoshoot experience I ever had. It took me 45 minutes to get there, only to find her in sweats and heels with a friend who was dressed up. She made it impossible for me to find her. When I got off the train, kept texting, "No, where are you?" every time I asked for her location, and then in the 5 minutes it took me to walk to her, though she said she'd meet me by the station, I pass a really cool storefront to use as a backdrop. I forgot exactly where it was, but it was within a 3-block radius. She not only heavily insisted and got frustrated when I didn't photograph her posing next to a homeless man. Within 45 seconds of us walking to find the storefront and her complaining about how far it is, she tells me she has to pee, and we spent 15 minutes looking for a bathroom. It's just me and her friend now, and her friend is really chill and shy. I actually vibe with her and am trying to snap a few pics of her in front of the little Mexican restaurant we stopped at with these cute lights. One of the photos of her friend is still on my page after a year, but anyways. This ducking girl comes out from the bathroom and sees me taking photos of her friends. She literally pouts, guys, and kinda in a whinny low voice says to me, "You didn't take any photos of me." I'm at my wits end and close to my breaking point, but I stay chill and tell her to kinda pose in the same spot. She does, but the entire time she has an extremely sour look on her face. I immediately stopped, told her friend to message me for the photos, deleted the few photos I took of this girl in front of her, and walked away without saying anything. Lesson learned for ignoring 485,929,819 red flags, lol. I had a guy who said everything I wanted to hear during the interview. I hired him into a lead position and put him on a easy job site the following day. I show up at 10 AM to see how was doing, and he wasn't. He hadn't done anything of value. He has set up one ladder. I asked him if he was okay and if he needed a hand getting his feet wet. He assured everything would be done on schedule and tells me a decent plan of execution. I leave to the next job site for an inspection feeling confident he would kick some ass. After the inspection I swung back by and the guy hadn't done any more work. I find his crew shooting the sheet and they tell me he went to a dental appointment. I call him, no answer. I set up the guys and get them going on the job after a half day was completely wasted. And I guess he was wasted too. I get a call from one of my guys on a delivery and he says one of my trucks is in front of the VFW. I drive over to investigate, and sure enough, bullshit McG is pounding $2 beers and smoking every cigarette in town. I ask the bartender if I can send him a drink. She filled a pint, then I wrote him a check for his time on site and put it in the beverage, and she brought it to him. He looked at the pint funny, then the bartender pointed at me and he looked at me with a shocked expression. I waved and said, "Your services are no longer needed," and walked out. He ran out and said he was just taking an early lunch. I told him he was free to do so and took truck keys from him and drove back to the job site. He broke the driver's side headlight by the time I came back for the truck later that afternoon. But apparently he did it in front of a crowd and someone called the cops on him and he ended getting arrested for resisting. Some people live the hard way. Not a record breaker, and I didn't actually get to fire them. I was working at a non-profit, running a small regional office. From time to time, we would have special fundraising drives to raise money for specific local programs. I would hire temp workers to call a cherry-picked list of supporters who were involved with the non-profit. So not cold calls, but not the most pleasant job point, because we were a non-profit and wanted to share the love, so to speak. We hired our temp workers from another non-profit who took in homeless people, gave them some training, and helped them get work experience. Win-win for both of us, right? Our fundraising calls get done, and they get recent work experience. I had 2 women start at 8 AM. Went through a brief training session with them, and started them working the phones. I hung around for a while, to be sure they weren't having any trouble, then I left for my morning appointments. I didn't spend much time in the office. I came back about 11 AM to check on them. The office was locked up and no one was there. I discovered the 2 women had taken all the minor electronics, think radio, DVD player, and helped themselves to my stash of change for the vending machines. Altogether, they couldn't have gotten more than $10-20 at a pawn shop for what they took, which was what they would earned with an hour's work. I called the other non-profit and told them what happened. That non-profit kicked them out. Those 2 women were homeless again. One of the stupidest things I've ever seen someone do was giving a new hire the tour of the facility, and we stopped in the kitchen. I explained there was to be no eating on the work floor, but the break room and lounge were both available for use during meal times. I pointed out the cupboards and fridge where he could store his lunch items, and showed him the coffee pot for common use. As I was pointing out where the coffee supplies were kept, he walked right up to the fridge, opened it and scanned it, took out a lunch box, and started going through it. I don't remember exactly what he took out, but it was a piece of fruit, a drink and a baggie of cookies or crackers. We sat down at a table and talked about some other basics and said we needed to get back on the floor. He returned to the fridge and grabbed something else out, and I reminded him his food need to be kept in the designated areas and he'd have to wait until later to finish his snack. Not 30 minutes later, while new guy was watching some training videos, a long-time employee came to my office upset that half her lunch was missing. As she described the items, I asked her if she had a red such and such lunch bag, and she said yes, that was hers. I immediately knew what had happened. Pulled new guy into my office and explained he must have the same lunch bag as his coworker and that it was her lunch he'd been eating. New guy replied that he did not, in fact, mix up her lunch bag with his own, as he hadn't even brought his own lunch. Yep, he stole someone else's food and ate it right in front of me in his first day. Needless to say, he was terminated for theft after less than 2 hours on the job. Company I work for runs group 2-week inductions for new temp employees. The inductions are led by 2 people, a professional trainer from an external company and a manager from our company. In this story, I was the latter, young white British girl, and the trainer was a British Indian dude called Ma'am. We'd done at least 4 to 5 inductions together. He's a good guy. We've walked our latest induction group from the front desk to the training room and sat them down. We are doing intros. As Ma'am is talking, I begin to notice a middle-aged white dude in the back who is making odd facial expressions and doing little quiet snort laughs at odd moments. We get to the point in the intro spiel where Ma'am mentions that he's a Muslim and will be stepping out of the training room for a large portion of Friday afternoons to attend his terrorist organization meetings at the mosque, and the white dude at the back gives the biggest snort yet. Ma'am and I make eye contact. I do my intro. We get the guys logging into the training room PCs and we are both floor walking. Old dude gestures me over and asks in a whisper me if it's hard to work with one of their lot every day. I held eye contact long enough to make sure he wasn't just telling a bad joke, then asked him to come with me, walked him to the front desk, took his access pass, and told him not to come back. He lasted maybe 40 minutes on the premises. Edit. Holy heck. Sort by controversial point. Ma'am's been making quiet jokes about, hey, isn't it funny how people think all Muslims are terrorists? Far as I know, yes. It's an icebreaker. Mostly it goes down well and people laugh. Occasionally it doesn't. The first time I heard that particular joke, I also found it pretty alarming, but it got a good laugh and we moved on. The dude that got fired needed to get fired. The words alone aren't the issue, but the tone, delivery and the derisive stares beforehand all pretty much made up a no, you're not a good fit. We have a fairly lax policy for recruiting temps, with the approach generally being to bring on a ton almost indiscriminately, then weed out the people who aren't suitable in the training room. Delicate hints of racism is one thing we find unacceptable, along with sexism. The dude who got fired is a prospective employee of ours who behaved in a way I consider inappropriate. Ma'am is a third-party employee that someone way above me has hired to fulfill a contract. We have no remit to reprimand or fire him. We are not even guaranteed to see the same trainer twice. Come with me, please is our standard way of firing someone in induction. It's a bit more chill and professional than declaring to the room that someone is being fired on their first day. To the person in the comments who thought it was snotty, I'm open to your take on what is a quiet and efficient way to pull someone out of a group of peers to fire them. I work in the theater industry and I have produced/directed quite a few actors whom I fired after a few days, but my quickest fire was actually a technician. Let's call him Noah. Noah was 19 years old and had been brought in because his father was a friend of the director or something, and I immediately realized that something was off about him. Firstly, he was easily 6 feet 4 inches, but probably only 150 pounds. Additionally, he was constantly asking the other staff members how to accomplish basic tasks, showing he knew nothing about tech. Point after lunch, I came in to find him attempting to sand a chunk of welding steel on the shop belt sander. For those who don't know, a belt sander is meant to grind down wood. Steel is harder than wood, and clearly ignoring the sparks flying from every opening in the machine. I later learned he'd decided he wanted to make a sword. I have 10 rules posted in my shop. 2 of them are: don't work in the shop without a buddy. If you break a power tool, you pay for it. As I shut off the power and explained to Noah that this would be coming out of his paycheck, he screamed and threw his sharpened pole of steel at me and ran out, violating my unwritten 11th rule: don't try to kill people. I was luckily unharmed, and he was fired after 7 hours of work. The director tried to chew me out, so I said I'd hire him back if I could throw the metal he sharpened at the director, which the producers found funny enough to back me up. TLDR, I fired a techie for breaking my equipment by making a weapon he tried to kill me with. During the 3rd year of my apprenticeship, we got a new colleague for the banquet department of the hotel. I had the job to show him what he would need to do during the day, since he had experience in the field, and during the next day he only had to take care 30 guests during 3 breaks. We decided to let him do it alone. I told him he should make the setup for the other rooms when he's done taking care of the guests. When I came to work the next day, he did nothing else than taking care of the guests for 9 faking hours. All in all, that's maybe a half hour of work, maybe 3/4 hour if you're slow. I do rarely lose my patience, but when my colleague leaves me like 7 hours of work just because he's lazy, I tend to be pissed. He just told me to make the setup is not part of his work. After he repeated that in front of the manager and in front of the director, even after they showed him that it was literally written down in his contract, he got fired. The worst thing was that he was the husband of our office lady that did send us our time workers. He did not only flushed his own reputation down the drain for the biggest hotel chain in Germany, he did also ruin his wife's reputation quite a bit. A day later, my manager told me that they also found out that he lied in his CV after they fired him. Edit. I almost forgot the dude that lasted a full 4 hours. This was in a company that produced food. The shifts started at 5 o'clock, what for most meant to get up around 3:30, because the company was located on the outskirts of the city. That company was very generous with breaks and such. You never worked longer than 2 hours until you had a break. They even paid you half an hour more than you actually worked every damn day. They were also very relaxed with new ones because you just need a bit of time to get used to get up so early. So we meet him at like 4:50 at lockers and say hello. Me and my colleagues go down to the production halls and make a little small talk with the boss and start working. The only one who doesn't show up is the new guy. After like half an hour, a guy from the production team comes to us, says there is somebody from your team. We had different uniforms, sleeping in the locker room. So we wake him up and start to show him really simple tasks, and he's not even able to the stuff on pallets. That's elementary school math. During the first break, I have a coffee and a cigarette with a coworker. Take guess who doesn't show up after break and is again sleeping in the locker room? Yes, it's the new guy. My boss was an old guy that worked there for over 20 years and was one of the nicest bosses I've ever had. Even for him, it was too much that somebody falls asleep 2 times during work, and he made it very clear that this shall not happen again. 10 minutes later, the new guy crashes with a forklift truck that he was not supposed to drive anyway into a container full of fish. He did not only destroy the fork, but also spilled 3,000 euro of fish and brine all over the place. After that he got screamed at by 3 different head of departments and fired. I hate never again seen that somebody got screamed at there or faked up so bad. They were all, including the department heads and the big boss, so nice and soft people that I never thought something like that could happen. Their point, I don't know how I could forget that dude. He was really the employee of the month. I was a super of a pretty large apartment community. I get a young guy from a temp agency. I start him off soft, show him around, ask what skills he has. The temp agency is usually great. They know I need skilled or semi-skilled guys and that I need serious candidates only. They also know that ones that work out can expect to work for me every day for a few months, maybe even a year. Steady work is tough to come by at a temp agency, so for the most part one gets sober responsible people who are in transition in their lives anyway. Kid tells me he can paint. Good deal. I have a 1-bedroom apartment that needs 1 coat. I have all the tools and materials on site already. Tarps laid out in the bedroom. That's a 1-day job for a good painter. I figure he'll get most of it done by his 4:30 quitting time and I'll finish and clean up. I walk him through the place explaining what I expect and any specific sheet he needs to know to get the job done. He is interested and attentive the whole way through, and I'm thinking we are good to go. We get to the back room and I'm getting ready to leave him when he pulls out his phone and sits on the 5-gallon paint bucket and starts texting. Okay, I've got a certain philosophy about how to get the most production out of workers based on 15 years of production management experience. So, before I leave I make sure he understands that I expect him to have this project done by quitting time. He assures me that he understands and will have no problem finishing and will get started shortly. So, I return about 11:45 to check his progress and let him know that if he would like to go to have pizza at lunch he can ride over with me and a couple of my guys. Damn, kid is still sitting on the bucket texting. So, I go in and tell him to pack his sheet. He's done and he has to leave the property immediately. He is so thick he thinks he's still going to get paid for his time. I've been managing restaurants for a few years now and have a few stories. Generally I'll hire everyone who shows within 5 minutes of their interview time and let them know that I'll let them go if things don't work out. That said, I've had some terrible hires. Hammy, a Middle Eastern gentleman, we concluded was probably just trying to get fired so he can tell his sugar daddy that he's actively trying to get employed while mooching it up. One time he tried to show me how to make an inedible dessert, which he did by sauteing mochi ice cream sandwiched in rice while repeatedly tapping the lid and smiling at me mischievously. It tasted exactly how you'd imagine. Yes, the ice cream melted. I had to have a talk with him about not smoking weed at our front door in uniform during business hours, not smoking cigarettes, or drinking inside our restaurant, and ultimately I fired him for dipping his ungloved fingers in all our soups. Then there was Didi, who had 14 years of experience and overzealous confidence, but he always reeked of whiskey and couldn't take extremely basic instructions like put that box down and help me make this food. He left on his own after 2 days. There was Chupacabra, who I caught stealing on camera. He then tried to blackmail me. He left on his own. One time I interviewed a guy really high on some sort of speed. He told me all about his struggles living out of his car. During our interview I had to tell him more than once to stop talking to our customers and employees. Ultimately I told him to come back sober and he'd get his job point. But ultimately my fastest fire was a server who agreed to work on the next 2 Sundays and then fed me bullshit excuses about not coming to work. Got fired on the 1-week anniversary of being hired. But over the course of that 7 days, we say her for a combined total of maybe 40 minutes, 30 of which were spent doing paperwork during the hiring process. The week went something like this. Thursday came in after an excellent interview to fill out paperwork for the job. Super funny middle-aged lady with great references. Gaps in employment history, but she had a military boyfriend, so it was understandable, based on the assumption that they moved frequently. Friday didn't show up for first day of work. We called her 2 hours into the shift, and she profusely apologized for misunderstanding. Claimed she was sure that someone said that she wasn't supposed to come in until Monday. Nobody said that, but okay, Fair enough, whatever. Monday she doesn't show up again. Call her number, and a different person answers. Ask them if they will pass on a message to her, and they scream expletives at me. Call back a couple of hours later, and she answers. Insists that she's had her own phone all day, and says that she had an unexpected health issue come up. Is obviously crying. Asks for the benefit of the doubt, says she really needs the job, and says that she will need the following day off. We agree that she needs to start on Wednesday. Tuesday, off with permission. Wednesday shows up early, clocks in, greets everyone, laughs a bit at herself for the chaos that has attended her tenure thus far, and immediately starts orientation. Just a few minutes into it, she asks to be excused. Goes outside and talks on phone for over an hour. It appeared to be a pleasant social call. She came back in after an hour, without hanging up, and smiled at us, and said that she needed to leave for a while. Thursday calls out. Is told that she will be fired if she doesn't come in the following day, and stay all day. Cries and says that we are unreasonable. Friday shows up several hours after her shift would have started, but never gets out of the car. She sits in the parking lot for several hours, then leaves. I called several times to let her know that her check would be mailed to her home address. She was paid for her time at orientation, as well as the few minutes of actual work, and the time she spent on the phone. The check was returned as undeliverable, with a note that the address was vacant. She just recently saw our help wanted ad, and contacted us about the job again. We politely declined to interview her. Wasn't a manager at the time, but our old manager had the mindset of if you have 10 fingers and 2 hands you're hired. Now usually this isn't a problem, and at the manager's discretion we could run a background check. He hired a fellow that had the look of a street hoodlum. Think someone you'd see hanging around 7 to 11 at 3 AM on a weeknight. Again, not usually a problem as we're a fast-paced labor-intensive production company that gets all types. Cut to this fellow's first day. I had to train him, no big deal. It's straightforward laboring. I did have a couple that's weird interactions in the morning with him. Something just felt a little off. Anyways, he's doing alright for his first day. Lunch rolls around, so we take our break. This new guy, myself, the foreman and 2 other staff are sitting around the break room lunch table eating, when out of nowhere the new guy launches into this story about how he had to cut a guy's eyelids off for a drug debt. All the while maintaining a disconcerting amount of eye contact with me. He finishes his story. The room is dead quiet. The foreman breaks the silence saying, "Jesus man." The new guy replies, "I know right." Fast forward to the end of the day. The boss calls the new guy, the foreman, and myself into the office. He tells the new guy that due to his criminal record he cannot continue his employment with us. The boss wanted me and the foreman in the office in case this guy lost it. Turns out the foreman went to the boss after lunch and said we should run a background check on this guy. The boss did, and when it came back it was full of charges for assault and theft, and turns out new guy just got out of prison 4 months prior. Now the old boss is gone. The foreman is the new manager and his hiring practices are far better than those of the old boss. For the rest of that week I was afraid the new guy would come back, because I guess it messed up his parole getting fired on his first day. About 3 hours we hired this guy as a contract software engineer. He was remote, so we did 2 phone interviews and he did really well. Seemed perfectly normal on the phone, and we were hiring via a recruiter, so they generally weed out the crazes on his first and only day of work. He shows up at the lobby at 10 AM. He was supposed to be there at 9. And we find out 1. He doesn't have an ID. He only has a black and white copy of a driver's license. 2. He never signed his employment paperwork, including the NDA. This meant that our security office couldn't even get a badge for him. During our walk to the security offices he tells us the story about how the night before he landed, he took a taxi to his hotel, which is like an hour away, by the way, and his credit card wouldn't work, and the taxi driver drove away with all of his luggage. And then he went into the hotel and they kicked him out, because he didn't have a way to pay for the room. Somehow he managed to go to another hotel and book a room, but now he was dealing with trying to get his luggage back. Almost immediately upon meeting him, I thought he seemed incredibly airheaded and distracted and his speech was somewhat slurred, but I wasn't sure if it was just this seemingly terrible course of events from the previous night, or if there was something else going on. To set the stage a bit, we were working in an area that was highly sensitive, where we demo projects to everyone outside of the company, and we use badge readers and retinal scanners for some rooms. We have $1 million equipment around us, and we do work that runs the gamut from national intelligence projects to entertainment, so it involves bringing in the FBI, CIA, high-ranking government officials, as well as various famous people, so security is incredibly important. But our specific project was a low security publicly released Sparks game that had just happened to be in the same building, on the same floor, and shared the secure entrance with all of these secret projects. We decide to bring him into our area that doesn't have anything sensitive, but is behind the main entrance doors and security people, and give him a laptop, and have him sign all of his paperwork. It's all digital on a web page. Within 30 seconds of giving him the laptop, all I hear is a bang of Windows throwing up errors. Like a dozen times. It was like he couldn't even manage looking over a website, entering in his info, and clicking next a few times. I had to help him use a simple web form, and it took him a full hour to do something that would take a regular person 5 or 10 minutes. By the time he had it completed was lunchtime, and I always take the new people out to lunch on the first day. We went to a burger joint on campus, and the guy is frazzled. Takes him like 5 minutes to order a burger, stuttering and acting confused for something so simple. We have free drinks here, and we've got a big refrigerator case full of Pepsi products, and on the other side of the room Coke products. He walked back and forth 3 times before settling on something. Like HRM. Not Pepsi. Oh, Coke. No, not Coke. But what about Pepsi? Nah. I think I'm feeling a Coke. No, maybe a Pepsi? The conversation was also nuts. This guy pretty clearly had issues with social interaction, and by the time lunch was over we walked back to the office, and into our secure area, and he said he needed to use a restroom. So I told him where it was, and went back to work. About 20 minutes after he went to the bathroom, he comes in with our project manager behind him, and I sit down with him to point him to our documentation and the basic getting started stuff. And then I go back to work. 30 minutes later there is a knock on our door, and when I open it there he is with one of the employees who works in a secure area, telling me that he found him in a highly secure area. To give you a better idea of the layout, in this building is a big open room with fancy white leather couches all facing a big screen TV and a small stage. We use it for press events. Off of this room is a bathroom. A set of glass double doors on one of the room that go to a secure area, another set of double doors on the other side leading to another secure area, and the only other door, besides the exit, is to our little projects room. Our door is a regular white door with a badge reader on the side, unlike the other 2 big black glass doors with secure area, restricted, do not enter in big letters. We find out that he had tailgated behind someone else, and had gone through one of those sets of doors, and was found wandering around. We walked him out immediately. After the dust had settled, we all talked internally, and I found out that my project manager that had walked him in earlier had found him hanging out one of the secure doors and trying to get in. We all think that the person we interviewed on the phone wasn't the same person. No idea who this guy was. No idea if he was intentionally there to try to get information on our unannounced projects, or whether he was just faked up mentally or something. It was, by far, the strangest and fastest time I've ever had to fire someone, and as you can imagine led to tons of inside jokes around the office. People to do painting around the shop has proven to be the most difficult task to hire for. So, how does the owner of the company end up doing a lot of painting tasks himself? One guy was making a career of painting one bar on one of the shelves that needed painting. I go out there an hour in to find he's done a mediocre job painting 5 linear feet, mushing the bristles of a $15 brush into the same edge of a crossbar, around and around and around. NVM, I don't need your help. Another guy, I very carefully explained which was oil paint and which was latex paint, and to mix only thinner with the first and only water with the second, and group the thinner/oil paint separately. Even 20 minutes later I check on him, and he gives me a big dude. Yeah, this paint you got isn't working well. In this 20 minutes, he's mixed water into both gallons of oil paint and thinner into 3 gallons of the same color latex paint, thus ruining all of the paint. perhaps thinking the only option is for him to stand around on the clock while I run by more. Oh, and he broke a $64 snap-on extended needle nose plier using it as a hammer to close paint cans, and denied that with a big attitude. Yeah, you're getting paid for 20 minutes today, now get the fuck out. These were temp jobs for friends of friends in need of work. Results from professional painting contractors proved to be a poor value for the dollar more than once. 2-point edit typo. I fired a guy within 10 minutes during his interview. He reluctantly divulged that he had been arrested for DUI, but insisted he was in a program and hadn't had a drink in 6 months. I checked with a couple of people on staff who he claimed to be friends with, and they warily vouched for him, saying he was a pretty good guy when sober, but with the caveat that he had a big, bad drinking habit in the past. So ignoring the red flags, I call him up to offer him the job, starting the next day. His reaction to the news was somewhat off, but I ignored it. The next morning, I called him half an hour after he was due at work. He groggily answered the phone on my second try and said he was on his way point. When he showed up, I was already pissed off, so I handed him a restroom cleaning checklist and told him to follow it step by step. 5 minutes later, he crashed the mop bucket into a dining table on the way to the restrooms. He crashed hard enough to capsize the bucket and create a huge spill on the wood floor. Mopping was literally the final thing on the checklist and shouldn't have been started for at least 45 minutes. At this point, I smelled booze on his breath, but told him to mop up his mess. I called my boss and told him the situation, and he gave me the go ahead to fire him. I told him he needed to clock out and leave. He asked why. Me, because you wrecked a mop bucket into a table and you reek of booze. His head began this slow motion sink that lasted about 5 seconds before his head snapped back up. Him, mouthwash. Me, I can smell the difference. You need to leave. I'm not a manager, but a warehouse supervisor. We had a temp/skills trainee walk off in his first 4 hours on his first day. This guy was just kind of off, the kind of off that you didn't want him holding a set of box cutters and standing behind you. So the day starts normal, and he is being taught how to stack boxes on pallets and wrap them for forklifts and such. He isn't lazy, but also isn't all that bright and just has that constant crazy eye look about him and won't say more than maybe 5-word sentences maximum. I don't think nothing of it and figure I better get used to working around this guy for the next 6 months or so until his contract is up. So lunchtime rolls around, and since he is new, he doesn't realize that he needs to stop and take his break that he is legally required to take. I go up to him and remind. He just stares at me for a few moments and goes to the office to clock out. He comes back out, and instead of going to the break room, he starts walking around the warehouse eating his sandwich. So I tell him that he can't walk around the warehouse eating his lunch while we have forklifts moving around freight. He says, oh, and goes off somewhere. After an hour and he hasn't clocked back in, I go looking for this guy. I check the freezers, aisles, office, bathrooms, parking lot, everywhere. Nobody has seen this guy for an hour, and he left all of his stuff at the warehouse. We call the sheriff's office and file a missing person report. They check his house and find out this guy walked 20 or so miles home. The dude walked home while eating his lunch and was going to clock back in from lunch tomorrow. He was officially fired after we learned that. The next day, I see on the local news that this guy gets stopped by police at around 10 at night with blood all over his clothes. Around the same time they find him, they get a call of a man that has been stabbed by his friend. This was actually just a few months ago, so he is still in jail, I think. TLDR. Fired 4 hours into his first day after he walked to his house that was around 20 miles away and didn't tell anyone. I started and managed my own restaurant in Norway, and the first weeks we were starting up we were hiring left and right. This one kid was interviewed by another employee and told to come in the next day. He came as planned and interrupted me while I was busy helping some costumers. I told him to wait for a moment on the side of the counter. Note that this was earlier the same day when he was supposed to sign his contract with us. He proceeded to pick his nose while leaning on the side of the counter right next to the costumers. So I took him to the side and explained that he couldn't do that in a restaurant. He apologized profusely, walked back, leaned on the counter with his bugger hand as well. I ignored it while finishing helping the costumers. He then got his uniform on, washed his hands, and stepped in behind the counter. No longer than 5 minutes after telling him not to pick his nose the first time, he started doing it again while I had eye contact with him, instructing him which cloths we used to wash the counter because he had leaned his buggers on it. Again he apologized profusely. I told him politely to just leave. He told me to speak to the employee that interviewed him the day before. I asked why. He answered, with an empty look on his face, because he told me I've already been hired and was supposed to work this whole shift. I wonder where the wings of life will take this human. TLDR, guy picked his nose twice during the first 5 minutes of his first shift in a restaurant. Not a manager, but was working with the guy during a summer moving job. In the mornings we all show up to the warehouse to get our job info and truck. My lead driver tells me we have a new guy, so show him the ropes while out at the first house. Usually it's nice having a new guy because it's an extra hand on what would be a job intended for one less person. For example, this was a 5-person job, but now we had an extra guy. Also we need to teach them how to lift heavy furniture so they get the majority of all that work. A can-do attitude would be an understatement with this guy. He was pumped to go move people's crap. An attitude which would surely die a quick death after a few hours. On the way to the house we were explaining how to load the truck. Boxes first, big furniture, mattresses, and then random stuff. Not too difficult. Plus the driver loads the truck, so you just bring them what they tell you they want next. He seems to get it. We get to the house, which was in the middle of the woods with no neighbors in sight. He is still pumped and runs into the house to get started. Instead of boxes he just brings anything he can find. The driver keeps telling him to bring boxes, but the guy wasn't listening. The driver is starting to get pissed off and tells the guy to sit in the truck if he's not going to listen. The new guy snaps, starts screaming, and runs away into the woods. Not back down the driveway, but into the great wilderness. We all started working again, thinking he just needed to cool off and would turn up sometime. A few hours later and still nothing. The driver called our boss, who ended up driving out to try and find him with no success. Never saw the guy again. I had to fire someone before she even started. I have a small ranch and I need some extra help during my pregnancy as it progressed. So I asked my former professor at the nearby college I went to if there were any agriculture students in need of some part-time paid work and hands-on experience. Made sure to tell him that I didn't mind training or outright teaching, but I needed this person to be willing to work hard and get stuff done. He gives me a few names. I talk to these agriculture students and finally offer the job to one girl who had taken a lot of the pre-vet classes but none of the hands-on classes on the school farm facility yet. She shows up for the first day of training and work in full contour makeup, massively overstyled hair, a short denim skirt, strappy red gingham tank top, sparkly cowboy hat, and gladiator sandals. Now, I don't care what someone shows up to the ranch wearing. You just gotta faking change when you get here. I asked her if she wanted to change in the hay barn or we could drive up to the house and she could change there, and she said she had no change of clothes. Didn't bring any other shoes. I asked her how on earth she planned on dealing with all the bugs, animal hooves, hiking around the property, and cleaning up animal poop in those shoes. She answered, I'm not going to touch pup. I'm just here to play with the animals and keep them company. Yeah. Right, honey. I'm not paying you $12 hour and giving you work experience credit / references to just play with my animals and take cute social media pictures while I still do all the same work as before. Not nearly as fast as some of the others here, but 2 shifts. Post-training. Middle-aged Russian lady had her own photography business before she moved to the US and in New Jersey, but couldn't make it work since moving to Florida. Seems like she might be overqualified for the school photography business, and there might be a language barrier, but she knew her way around a camera, so my co-manager and I gave her a shot. Well, it turns out we hired her at the wrong time. We didn't actually need her until about 5 weeks after we hired her. So there was an awkward conversation asking her to come in for training for a new product line. Point training lasted 2 days. Day 1 is noobers only. Day 2 we bring the veterans in alongside the newbies. All through training she was asking about carpooling, saying how she had recently damaged her car. Cool, no problem. We always carpool when possible. It's a good chance to get to know your colleagues. Friday rolls around. She comes in, meets the other photographer she'll be working with, white guy, 15 to 20 years her junior, and they head off for an hour and 20-minute drive to the graduation point. The next day comes round, bigger graduation. Bigger team, 3 photographers, middle-aged Russian lady, 1 black guy, and 1 darker-skinned Latin guy. All of a sudden, she doesn't want to carpool anymore, and before I can give her the correct address, the graduation was happening at a convention center, not the school. She's in her own car and gone. I'm talking about this with some of the management team on Monday. It really set alarm bells off for me, but a couple of my female managers pointed out that they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable being in a car with 2 guys they didn't know. Then someone says Optic is probably right. She told Friday Night Photographer that she hates Muslims, so I called the guy she worked with on Friday night, and sure enough she had told him that she hates Muslims. So I filed her paperwork later that day. Point in a bizarre twist, she sent me a happy Father's Day text. I'm a manager at a manufacturing facility. I work 3rd shift. One night I'm on break at our smoking gazebo. I see a couple and driving erratically. I approach as we have no security, and I'm pretty much it. As I get closer I can see it's a guy in a lime green shirt that our temp to hires wear. He sees me and drives off. I thought it was odd, but I put it out of my mind and went back to work. About 2 hours later I get a call to respond to the break room that someone is passed out. I quickly respond. I get there and I see the same guy as before. I woke him up, and as soon as he spoke I could smell alcohol. I asked who he was, and he told he was Mike, and he was here to work. No one knew him. Our shift is small, maybe 40 people. There are no strangers. So I called the cops. They give him a breathalyzer. His blood alcohol is to the point of being poisoned. The cops call an ambulance. I help the cops load him in. I escorted the cops out of the building. I'm bullshitting with them when they get a call that he has jumped out of the ambulance and ran back inside. The cops drive around to the back of the building where he jumped out at. I go in and of course I'm the first to find him. At this point I'm pissed. I'm fat and I hate running. I jerk him up and say 2 things are going to happen. You are going to sit down and you are going to shut the fuck up. At this point the cops show up and put cuffs on. They were going to just let it slide, but he ended up with a public intoxication charge. The cops found 2 empty bottles of vodka in his car. Of course I had to report all of this 2 hours. I was then informed he had been hired full-time earlier that day, that he worked 2nd shift. I guess he celebrated a little too much after he got off work. He was employed full-time less than a day. Not a boss. Don't insult me like that. I'm a long-time employee. Took this kid, 21-year-old, out on a service call, his first one. We are fixing semi-trucks on the side of the road. This rig had a blown cack hose. This is a 5-minute job. I drove us to get the part, and I've got classic country on the radio. He says he's going to punch me in the face if I don't turn it off. I pulled over and said let's do it now. One of us will be walking back. He changed his mind on fighting me. Now he is driving, and somehow navigating on an interstate is a problem for him. Okay fine, he's new. We get there late as hell, and putting on the 2 hose clamps blows his mind. Has got at, see. He's freaking out in front of a driver doing this job, while I sit on the tailgate and watch. A cack hose takes 0 skill. I even brought new clamps. He fails at the job, and I fix it in moments. Now I hate this faker, but I'm supposed to watch out for him, so I'm trying to genuinely help him do a good job. I'm actively trying to get him to not fuck up this one-man rock fight. Okay fine, fuck it, let's go back. Nobody is Mr. Goodwrench the first day. Well, time to check Facebook for him, and holy shit his brother Cork blocked him on Facebook. Now we are doing 90 sliding between traffic in the service truck, whilst he taps out responses to his brother on Facebook. trying to cock block himself with some girl he was stalking. We come down the last off ramp and the tires are off the ground for a moment when we exit the interstate. How do I know they were off the ground? He stomped the brakes midair and the tires chirped when they hit the pavement again. We took a right at the bottom of the ramp, running the red light. He looks left after we've entered the intersection. I asked why he looked, since we'd be dead anyway if there was traffic. We get back in the shop and he's calling his brother and running around screaming into his phone for a few minutes. I texted the boss, told him this kid had a Facebook emergency while driving. Boss said send him home and don't give him my number. This was Friday. He came back Monday morning to get fired. Turns out he was tossed out of the Marines for similar behavior during basic, and apparently midway there were huge, complicated arm-length Marines tattoo. Saw him a few years later. He hit a customer with their own car earlier that day at his new job and had been fired. Now he'd like to reapply. He wasn't rehired. Not a manager, but I saw something like this. Worked in the back room of a department store. Dude came to work with us. Lasted a week because didn't wear a belt. His pants hung below his ass, which is a hazard in the backroom point because you can trip and break your face. Our coordinator back there, one of my favorite people, told him he needed a belt, so he said he'd report her for sexual harassment if she brought it up again. He would later offer to take her out for drinks, which will soon be relevant. The managers came back to tell him to buy a faking belt and he flat out said I'll buy a belt when you pay me enough for one. We sold belts, cheap, and got an employee discount. I bought a belt from this store and it worked fine. I still have it. He argued with the managers till one said fuck it and bought him a belt. He never wore the damn thing. In his week-long stay he left early every day. He would show up and tell the manager he could only stay a couple hours. You need to notify them in advance, but he didn't seem to get that. One time he said he had a doctor's appointment at 11:30, so he had to leave at 11. He showed up at 8, by the way. At 11:05 I made my way to the break room to find him still there aggressively hitting on a coworker I was friends with. He was asking her all these personal questions. Where do you live? How old are you? She had none of his shit and dodged every question. He eventually called her thick, and I finally told him to knock it off and not call her that, to which he responded, why? She's not skinny. When my break was up at 11:20, I left with the girl following me, and Loverboy finally said I gotta get to my doctor's appointment. The math of this does not add up. We like to joke around and have fun in the back room. I left, but we still hang out every so often. One guy, who had spent the last 10 years learning MMA, made a crack about the new guy being gay, not in a homophobic way. One of the guys working there was gay, and we loved him, so the new guy threatened to stab him. My friend just laughed in his face and moved on. Meanwhile, new guy made a suicide joke to the aforementioned gay coworker, who opened up that he'd attempted suicide in the past and would rather not listen to these jokes in a very respectful manner. New guy laughed at him and continued point after unloading the truck. We processed the merchandise, put tags on it, and sorted etc. Numbnuts was taught how to process handbags by the coordinator and told to ask if he needed help. He went on to do everything wrong and was confronted by a manager about this. I was working nearby and listened to him lie about how he was following orders exactly told to him by Miss. He never learned a single name. We were all Miss or Sir. It got confusing. The manager gave Miss sheet, so she came back to talk to Numbnuts and ask why he lied. So he continued to lie and say that he never said any of those things and the manager was making it up. I told my coordinator what I witnessed and tried to clear it all up later. Lastly, he showed up whenever, went on break for as long as he wanted, and left whenever he felt like it. He eventually just stopped showing up and got fired. I have never seen someone so inept at something in my life. I flunked out of college twice and yet could still do that job. He was 6 years older than me, had never held a job before, and lasted a week faking idiot. I work in a warehouse where industrial machinery and other hazards are everywhere. We don't drug test new employees as a general rule. I don't care what you do in your free time, as long as it doesn't affect your work and you aren't hurting anybody. But for everyone's safety we will require someone to submit to a drug test if we suspect they are under the influence of any substance while on company property. All new employees are made very aware of this procedure during their interview. Dude shows up for his first day stoned out of his goddamn mind. Crimson red eyes, saggy lids, and he absolutely reeks of weed. He shows up late and walks to a seat in the back of the training room while I'm delivering orientation to the other new hires, so I'm not aware of this fact right away. But it became quickly apparent when he started loudly saying whoa at random times, and when he raised his hand and asked me to start everything over because he wasn't listening. I call everyone down for a short break to resolve this issue in private. I take Dude aside and tell him I'm going to make him submit to a drug test, then hand him off to a coworker to drive him to the testing facility so I can finish orientation. When they get to the testing place, Dude guy knows his goose is cooked, and in a stroke of genius he makes one last ditch effort to save himself. He pretends to text his mom, says he needs to ask the nurse where the bathrooms are, and slides his phone across the counter to her with a message typed saying, "Yo, can you hook me up with some clean pee cause I could really use some right now." Nurse calls my coworker over, and Dude guy is well and truly done. I usually hate firing people, but this one made me feel good to type about. I work in security over a huge warehouse of a company that you've definitely heard of. Hired this new guard to sit next to a door that truck drivers come in and out of until about 10 p.m. At 11 p.m. the door's alarm turns on. The guard was scheduled to be off at 10, but because their relief was late, they had to stay late. You can't leave a post until your relief is there. Anyways, 11:10 p.m. rolls around and new guard decides they want to take a smoke break. Perfectly fine. They can step outside at least 20 feet from the door and they'll still be able to see the entry point. Well, this guard was unaware of the alarm and sets it off when exiting. No big deal. I can clear it out at the control desk easily instead of just calling me on the radio to ask what you do or that there is an alarm going off. New guard panics and pulls the fire alarm that's next to the door. The entire building was evacuated. 1,000 plus employees mid-shift during the busy hours of their shift all had to sit outside in the cold for over an hour while the fire department had to figure out what the hell caused the alarm, which led back to new guard. Warehouse manager was pissed. Company lost production for over an hour and needless to say the new guard wasn't back the next day. When she came high on something other than weed. On her third day of training. Wouldn't stay on station, kept trying to taste the new plates coming out. She'd been given samples of our specials the day before and apparently cursed at a few customers and rolled around on the floor while crying in what my assistant manager assumed was Yoruba. We calmly walked her to the back on the start of this Friday lunch shift and outside the restaurant. Explained to her that her behavior was inexcusable. Insert stories about family and kids. Told her to call me Monday regardless. Many statements taken from everyone on shift. No call the next Monday. Gets out for aggravated sexual assault a few months later. Thing is, my assistant manager was loudly gay. Like, guy got Todrick Hall's attention for twerking in the drag. I was just married and looking nowhere, and there were CCTV cameras showing her throwing pallets and trying to hug me with as I'm pulling her off me. Fact, dealing with that process in small claims for a training paycheck. Right. I found out a few months later that hiring on Craigslist was a bad idea when some white ass milk guy comes for his practical interview, loses his sheet by the end of the major lunch rush, and locks himself in the staff washroom. Bills had kicked in worse than VTEC. Bawling his ass off, curled up in the corner. Nigerian girl had told him to try when she recognized our boilerplate CG post to make him entrap us, his babbling words. This is well the Cliff's Notes version of a few months of what the fuckery, but it certainly tops dealing with the transgenders who couldn't see hairnets as sanitation requirements vs prohibiting their expression. I kept a beard and kept a beard net on, damn it, or the casually lazy. My mom died and I'm here after 3 days. Shows picture from family retreat to maybe future coworkers. Of family, mom alive and well, at a weekend cottage. Lol. Good old Derek. Derek was a 50-ish-year-old single guy, and his parents had money. They paid his rent, and for other necessities. Old Derek had a major drug/alcohol problem. He got hired as a server, because the owner knew his parents and they pretty much begged him to get him a job. He had serving experience, and he passed the training/tests that all servers have to pass in order to work there. It was a very high-end steakhouse. Other than him being extremely happy and amped up all the time, on coke and oxycontin/heroin, things went okay for his first week. Then he came in on his day off, wasted. Like extremely wasted. He sat at the bar and tried to convince the bartender to give him a soda. Nothing wrong with that, right? Well, he wanted to pay for it with a credit card that had his father's name on it. He opened it up and proposed to the bartender that he would leave a $1 tip with the card and split it between them. Basically, he wanted $500 in cash so he could go buy drugs. So this was the method he chose. Well, the bartender said no, and when he did, old Derek lost it. He started smashing glasses, flipping tables, and cursing out everyone in sight. The cops came, but he scurried off like the little rat that he was before they got their point. That was his last day as an employee of the restaurant. The best part is that he came back a year later and asked if he could put a vending machine in the lobby. This place is very famous, and a filet mignon costs $60 just by itself. Lol. He was laughed at and immediately warned that the police would be called if he didn't teleport out of the building. The last thing I heard about him was indirectly, his younger brother, by 3 years, died from a heroin overdose and was found by his 7-year-old daughter. Even people from privileged backgrounds stand no chance against opiates. Not sure if this counts as quick, but let's find out. I had a new soldier show up to my squad. The first day he showed up, he decided to parade around the workplace showing erotic homosexual furry porn to other soldiers without their consent, literally shoving it in their faces, and reading homosexual erotic literature aloud at his desk. I immediately told him that his actions were extremely inappropriate and that he needed to stop. He refused my order and continued to test my patience by arguing and saying that I was discriminating against homosexuals and that he was going to report me to the sharp NCO, which was me. I took him aside and attempted to confiscate the reading material. He refused to relinquish the document, so I proceeded to smoke the ever-living shit out of him until he took it out of his pocket. This lasted for about 5 hours. The next day I get a call to appear at the 1SG's office. The 1SG informed me that this soldier went to the clinic and said he was going to commit suicide because of the hazing and discrimination he received due to his sexual orientation. I was ordered to escort him to Bethesda Memorial Hospital in DC for a psych evaluation and subsequent admission to a suicide watch. He entered the vehicle with a backpack filled with movies, a laptop, and bucks, snacks, and pink fuzzy socks, and said, "Ready for some fun, Sergeant?" We sat in a patient room for around 15 hours while waiting to be seen by a doctor. During that time he explained that he never wanted to be in the military and that he was purposely pulling a stunt to exit the military after receiving extensive training on satellite communications, spacecraft control, and reception of a TS clearance. I pointed out the flaws in his plan and that I was going to contact all involved and he would lose everything he worked over a year for. He continued, stating, "It's your word against mine, Sergeant. Go do your best to stop me." I had a recording device on my person for this exact reason. Sire Beach. I left the waiting room that instant, displayed this evidence to the attendant, and he was immediately discharged. He caught wind of what had happened once security had showed up, and he attempted to flee the area. Security tracked him down, cuffed him, and allowed me to take him back to the unit. I showed the recording to my superior, and it was out of my hands from there. To this day I have never seen paperwork processed so quickly. He showed up to the unit on a Monday. By Friday he had orders for a dishonorable discharge. He lost his clearance as well. Yeah. Something I can contribute/rant. I was an assistant manager at a Korean/Chinese restaurant. Manager was out on holiday, said before he left he found a new waiter, and asked me to show him a few things while he is out. Should be no trouble. Well, should be. Point guy comes in an hour late than agreed. Said his car broke down midway and had to walk. I said, well, next time call us so we know what is happening. Then I asked him to change from his t-shirt and shorts. He said he doesn't have any. Not what we agreed, as we tell everyone to come in black shirt and trousers. So I lent him my spare ones. Fine. 15 minutes later he changed into my spare clothes. He was on bar duty with one of our waitress. It's very normal to start at the bar as it's relatively easy work and you get to see how the team works, etc. I guess he saw the waitress and he tried to impress to showing off his skills. Well, the dumbass tried to mix a cocktail. No cocktails was ordered, by the way. It was a test to see how good the is. Hand slipped, cocktail shaker flies, and hit the waitress on the head. She fell back with drinks now drenching her shirt, like some comedy sketch. She went home to change. So here I'm one bartender short, some dumbass, and had to change the setup. Point. Okay, I will put all of this down on nervousness and impress waitress on your first day. So I took him away to one side and asked him to relax and just stand and observe how things worked. Don't try to do anything. He said thanks, went to the bar, cracked open a cold beer, sat on the bar seats. The dumbass thought I was asking him to do that. Many of you restaurant workers know, sometimes it's okay to crack open a beer while you work at the bar, as work is hell stressful, and I don't really care that much if you have won the end of the shift hidden from paying customers. The sheet having the balls to do that in direct view of customers both at the bar and in the restaurant area. Yeah, he was fired and he wanted to keep the beer and I had to escort him out. The sheet never returned my clothes too. When I called and asked them back, he blackmailed me for firing him against labor laws. He never signed a contract and he said he won't return until I pay for his mental damage. Needless to say, I didn't care that much about the clothes. Not a manager, but witnessed the firings. TLDR at the bottom. Point. First guy was the quickest I've ever seen. He lasted 3 days. He disclosed during the interview that he had some kind of issue where he has trouble taking what you just taught him and actually doing it. I don't remember exactly, but basically he came off as really slow in the head. If you catch my drift. Point. My manager gives him a chance because we were desperate. His very first day was with me and the assistant manager. In one 5-hour shift he managed to insult both of us because as we were talking to him about where he was from, we somehow started talking about our cars. He said he had an old car. It was only 2 years old, and when we said our cars were going on 15 years, he said that he wouldn't want us in his house because he'd be afraid we'd steal stuff because we are poor. Later he said he was only working here because he was saving up money to buy camera equipment because he wanted to start his own porn business, then proceeds to ask the assistant manager if she'd like to star in one of his first films because she has the body for it. Point. I wasn't there for his second day, but on his third day the manager had him and another employee doing the same task. He was so slow that the manager fired him on the spot. The other person I know of lasted about 2 weeks. On her second week she was working on a busy Saturday. She noticed someone out in the crowd that was staring her down, so she went to confront them. Apparently she knew this girl and they had beef. The employee proceeded to get jumped by the girl giving the looks. The girl's sister and their mom. Point. The manager wasn't going to fire her miraculously, but mall security had contacted corporate and told them about the incident, and they insisted that he fire her. TLDR. First guy said the assistant manager and I would steal stuff from him if we went to his house because we are poor, and then asked the assistant manager to star in his porn. Gets fired 2 days later because he is super slow. Point. Second person found her arch nemesis while still being in her work uniform. Gets fired once corporate finds out. Edit. Oh my god, I just thought of another example after reading some of the comments. This one was actually quicker than the guy who lasted 3 days because these two people lasted about 15 minutes. I had gotten a new job recently, ended up having to quit because the heat was too much for me, and 2 people were fired within the first 15 minutes of orientation because they kept falling asleep. Granted it was 8 AM on a Monday, but you're about to start a job where you had to be there at 6 AM and be ready to work your ass off, and you can't even stay awake. I managed a company that laid sod and my boss said that he was giving me a new employee Initially I was very excited, extra handsome, more work could be done in less time, we need more money potentially every day. At the time I was making about $5,000 a month. The following day I meet the guy, pick him up, and we head to the new job site, which was way uptown in a fancy neighborhood. There was a new school that needed sodding and some light grading. When you first got in the car I thought he looked a bit trashy, but I'm not usually one to judge, especially since you're about to go do hard labor. Of course you're not going to try to care about how you look. So I kind of start giving him interview questions, and I shit you not, I asked him right off the bat what his life dream was or something like that, and he replies with he wants a Cool Whip bowl full of meth. I was speechless. So I kept thinking, we'll shit, at least he should be a good worker, I mean meth heads can't quit moving, right? We get to the job site, we are working for maybe an hour, 2 hours. Anyway, I look over at one of my other employees and ask where he went, and they said he went inside the school, which was still under construction at the time. So I go inside to look for him, and he is literally laying on the concrete floor sleeping. I didn't even bother to wake him up or to get him to come back to work, because I was just going to fire him and not pay. At the end of the day I tell him we will no longer be needing him. When he tries to argue with me saying he was just really hot and tired, I go to my manager and I explain to him what happened, and he tells me that the man lives with his sister, needs to pay his rent, so I can't fire him. I continually try to fire this man for the next year, at least weekly. Late to the party, but I'm the lab supervisor and one out of the 2 vaccine coordinators at the clinic I work at. We have a medical assistant who is quite frankly terrible at her job. Nice girl, great with people. Problem is, she cannot file charts to save her life. She files John Doe before David Doe and Alice Doe, and no matter how hard I try to help her correct this, she can't seem to grasp the concept of basic ABCs. And she says she isn't even dyslexic. Another thing is that she never finishes filling out paperwork, leaves spaces blank on forms, never initials anything. She messes up laboratory blood work orders pretty frequently, sometimes getting patients billed for quite a bit more than what we quoted them. These aren't the main things that she should be fired for, though. For some context, we started providing shingles vaccines recently. For those who don't know, the shingles vaccine needs to be reconstituted with a special diluent before being administered, and not with the usual sterile diluent like with varicella and MMR vaccines. Generally the Shingrix vaccine comes in a box with 8 vaccines and 8 special diluents. Different cap colors to help distinguish them. Just earlier this week, she managed to give 3 shingles vaccines that she reconstituted with just regular diluent, rendering them useless. That's about $2,000 worth of Shingrix. She claims she didn't know this, despite the package insert, and the vials clearly displaying they are to be reconstituted only with the special diluent. Generally any healthcare provider, hospitals, etc. that gives vaccines requires the vaccines to be checked by 2 people before drawing them up to ensure accuracy. As far as I know this is not legally required, and we have never had issues like this before. Due to this we are now required to use this method for accuracy's sake, and it makes sense to me. As for me, if I were the physician who owns the clinic, I would fire her without hesitation, because all in all she has wasted around $10,000 of the owner's money. Not a official manager, but I once started the training for a guy who lasted a week. His first week was also my last. I had already put in my 2 weeks notice, but as I was the head of my crew, my boss asked me to start his training. First thing that night we had to move some pallets around. I asked him if he knew how to work a pallet jack, just a little hydraulic, hand operated one, and he said he did. Great, move these 6 pallets over there, and let me know when you're done. It should have taken his 5 minutes maximum to move them. After about 15 minutes I still hadn't heard from him, so I went to go check. He was still trying to get the truck into the first pallet. Alright man, if you don't know how to do something that's fine, but let me know, so I can teach you. It's no big deal. Over the course of the week, he gets way too familiar with the 3 of us on that crew, colon ulcers and all. I left at the end of that week, but I was still on good terms with the boss, who lives a few doors down from me, and helped me land that job in the first place. He told me that the following Monday the dude went into work and the store manager stopped him and said he failed his UA and had to be fired. This dude threw a major fit, cussing and screaming at the manager for like 15 minutes before he left. If he had just left when he got fired, he could have gotten clean and re-applied no problem. But no, the manager decided to basically just blackmark him so that he could never be hired there again. And this dude was also around 45, and the next oldest on our crew was like 25. Not fired, but I walked out 30 minutes into an interview / shadow, 10 of which were spent waiting and 10 riding the subway. We get to our first address on a long list of many. We go up and knock on the door. Some kid answers. According to the ad, the job was direct sales. I figure I've done that before, no problem. Door-to-door sales, awesome. They ask for his mom or whoever, then they start trying to sell the kid a service before mom even comes out. Then they spend 15 minutes trying to sell mom a service before she finally basically kicks us out. I was faking mortified. They were all super into it and probably had their soul sucked out by this company / work point. As soon as we got out, I looked right at them and said, "This is what you do. Thanks but no thanks. Appreciate your time and I'm sorry, but I'm out." The look on both their faces was faking priceless. They seemed like 100% genuine shocked. I was surprised this was the first time they had this happen. They asked if I needed directions to the subway, and even though I did need directions and had a metro card, I just said no thank you and walked off. I walked over 50 blocks through Midtown just to get the hell away. They were an intermediate. They bought electricity in bulk from various companies for the lowest rate and then resold it at markup to people. The idea was, if they bought in bulk they could make a few bucks undercutting the power companies. Only when I got there did I find out there was no base pay and it was all commission on what you sold. And the two women who tried to take me around seemed like the most sincere, sweet people ever. Then they put their sales face on and they seriously turned into apex predators. Was kinda creepy. Lesson learned though. Oh, and we won't even mention the time I got hired to go around and get people to try and renew their contracts. But even after they said I had the job, I didn't start for 3 weeks. The second week was Hurricane Sandy. I get a text saying, "Oh yeah, we are not working out of the office week, but you should totally come down to Philly to party. I mean, have a training conference for 3 days." Cause I could afford that shit. I ended up telling them that they were basically a MLM scheme and I knew it, and to leave me the fuck alone. Yeah, I did use those words. I was sick of being jerked around by people who seemed to be running an MLM and using the profits to enjoy wild getaways and parties. Not fired, but I walked out 30 minutes into an interview / shadow, 10 of which were spent waiting and 10 riding the subway. We get to our first address on a long list of many. We go up and knock on the door. Some kid answers. According to the ad, the job was direct sales. I figure I've done that before, no problem. Door-to-door sales, awesome. They ask for his mom or whoever, then they start trying to sell the kid a service before mom even comes out. Then they spend 15 minutes trying to sell mom a service before she finally basically kicks us out. I was faking mortified. They were all super into it and probably had their soul sucked out by this company / work point. As soon as we got out, I looked right at them and said, "This is what you do. Thanks but no thanks. Appreciate your time and I'm sorry, but I'm out." The look on both their faces was faking priceless. They seemed like 100% genuine shocked. I was surprised this was the first time they had this happen. They asked if I needed directions to the subway, and even though I did need directions and had a metro card, I just said no thank you and walked off. I walked over 50 blocks through Midtown just to get the hell away. They were an intermediate. They bought electricity in bulk from various companies for the lowest rate and then resold it at markup to people. The idea was, if they bought in bulk they could make a few bucks undercutting the power companies. Only when I got there did I find out there was no base pay and it was all commission on what you sold. And the two women who tried to take me around seemed like the most sincere, sweet people ever. Then they put their sales face on and they seriously turned into apex predators. Was kinda creepy. Lesson learned though. Oh, and we won't even mention the time I got hired to go around and get people to try and renew their contracts. But even after they said I had the job, I didn't start for 3 weeks. The second week was Hurricane Sandy. I get a text saying, oh yeah, we're not working out of the office week, but you should totally come down to Philly to party. I mean, have a training conference for 3 days. Cause I could afford that sheet. I ended up telling them that they were basically a MLM scheme and I knew it, and to leave me the fuck alone. Yeah, I did use those words. I was sick of being jerked around by people who seemed to be running an MLM and using the profits to enjoy wild getaways and parties. Fastest I know of someone being fired, like an honest he had the job and was on payroll and was fired. About 3 days. Hired at a car wash / quick lube. He thought he was hired to wash and dry cars. They had him changing oil. He complained because he couldn't work on a car to save his life. He crashed one car pulling it in, and they let it go. Then he crashed a pickup into the corner of a wall because he had no idea how to drive a truck and they were like, dude, you're done. Someone else I knew was a member of a paid fire department for about 3 weeks until he got arrested at like 2 AM for DUI on a highway like 50 miles from home in his station uniform. His mugshot even has him wearing his FD badge. Don't think I need to say how fast he was put on admin leave and quietly fired. Worked a warehouse job for a couple of years as a welder. We had a new forklift driver start at 8 o'clock on a Monday, supposedly with experience. He was told to remove crates from bay 1 on the floor and load them into bay 1 on the dock. He fired up his chariot of doom, revved the poor propane engine half to death, and sped off in the wrong direction. About half a minute later, Speedy comes tearing around the corner with an entire shelving unit on the forks. No warning lights, no siren, just a big dumb smile. He drove the truck right into the dock bay, twisting the shelves together, causing them to scream under the strain. The foreman jogged over to see what the hell is going on, just as Speedy slams the forklift in reverse, at full speed, and runs directly over the foreman. In his infinite wisdom, gleaned from previous work experience, Speedy jumps out of the truck, looks down at the broken, graining, bleeding foreman and says, hey, dude, like you need to watch where the fuck you're going, before you get someone killed. Despite a couple of broken ribs and a badly fractured clavicle, boss man got up off the floor, grabbed Speedy by the throat, dragged his ass 5 feet, and threw him off the loading dock. We never saw Speedy again, and the straw boss had to take a couple of weeks off, but the rumor around town is that Speedy is still paying off that doctor's bill point. Wherever you may be, Speedy, I hope you never reproduced, and if you did, your wife / girlfriend / how had the fortitude to do the right thing and drown them in a pond. I'm a little late for the party, but some people thought I knew. I work at a very popular Chinese restaurant chain. The fastest we fired someone was when we found out she needed a break every hour or so because of back problems. But the second fastest was because this one chick was insane. She would get right up in your face and yell at you for the dumbest shit. We hired a lot of bipolar people somehow. The first night my lead cook was training her to close the dish station. Now, one of my 4 girls was closing steam table and had to use their trash can to dump food because it was the only one big enough. This is standard practice. The boss is required to be able to lift more than 4, which is why they get paid more. This chick comes up and starts screaming at the girl. Oh hell no, I'm not carrying that out. You're gonna do it. Keep in mind that the girl didn't say a single word to her and she just came up out of nowhere and got mad because she was using her trash. The girl tells her that it's the boss job to take out the trash at night since the FO takes out the trash during the day. She goes on a rant about how she can't lift it and then goes up to another bar worker and tells him to do it for her. I have to educate her on the proper way to ask someone for help. She gets fired the next day because she dropped a bag of chow mein on the floor and tried to use it. A guest complained and she ran up and screamed at him for it. It's in a bag, dumbass. Can't you see it's in a fucking bag? Stupid as. Then there was a girl who had no idea what work was. I was training her for another store that was opening up. While I was showing her how to clean the bathroom, she told me that the reason she had never had a job before is that she refused to clean the bathrooms. She still didn't want to, but decided not to mention it in her interviews anymore because it was obviously keeping her from getting a job. I told her that if she wasn't going to clean the restrooms there, she was probably going to get fired. so she did help me, but complained the whole time. Then she asked if she could go home because her dad was outside and her schedule said she was supposed to get off at 9:30 when we close. I had to explain to her that working until close means you have to close a store. I was surprised her dad didn't know that. Maybe he worked retail. She asked, so how long will it take? Like 15 to 20 minutes. No. It takes 2 hours to clean the store. She was absolutely shocked. After every task, she would ask, is that it? Nope. I said it was gonna take a while. And after all that, she was most surprised that we had to mop the floors every night. She obviously had no chores at home to deal with. The next morning she asked to change her availability to only mornings and was let go because of it. She only made it one day. Not a manager, but a team lead. That was part of the process for 2 new hires that got fired. They lasted a little less than 3 weeks, but managed in that time to fill up enough reports that 3 people have 4 pages of bulleted reports for each of them, and a 4th person had 2 pages for both. First person, let's call her Linda. Linda came to work to be Photoshop editor. I knew there was going to be trouble cause a co-worker came up to me, pulled me aside, and said he had her in a college class, and that she was notorious for having to be told over and over again what to do, and to be ready for that. No big deal. I was 2 years out of college and had dealt with people like that before when I worked as a tutor, so I thought shouldn't be too bad. No, I was wrong. I had to teach her the same Photoshop skills every day. She was more worried about looking like she knew what she was doing than doing it. Data. She brought in a huge container of markers, highlighters, pens, and pencils, even though we supply everyone with some of those. Our job doesn't really require a lot of writing/drawing, just some normal note taking here and there. But she would make elaborate notes and diagrams for anything we showed her how to do, even though it might something as filling in work time on an Excel sheet. We had a special thing going for a few busy weeks where, if volunteered for enough odd hours, you got even more pay than the time and a half and more PTO. So yeah, you wanted to track those hours. I had made a simple Excel thing that would total you time. You just entered in the time into each cell for a clock in and clock out, and total would appear. This somehow made 3 pages of notes in her book. Only other things she really did bad was bad talk the managers behind their backs with no reason, claiming they didn't help her enough despite spending hours going over things again and again with her. Next person hired at the same time for Photoshop. Name we will use is Maximum. Maximum still pisses me off today. First off, like Linda didn't know much about Photoshop. Had to show him just about everything a few times. One thing about Maximum to know was that he was an old man and was super stubborn and way over the top sexist. He started off day one letting us all know that he was only there so he'd have more money so his wife could buy more purses. The thing was, the way he said it, his tone, body language, and even some of the comments he made afterwards left you with the feeling that his real comment was, my wife likes to buy purses cause that's what women do, buy stupid things. I really wish I could remember all the comments, but that was what I walked away with. When it came to training, we had 2 women trainers, myself and my manager at the time, who is lady too. I started to notice that every time they would try to teach him something, he would stare off and just go yep, yeah, that is how you do it, condescending tone of voice, like they were telling him something he should be told, but in reality he did cause he was messing things up badly. Yet when I'd go and tell him the same thing, he was all looking at the screen and paying attention. Sadly, this is where I learned a huge lesson that still make my throat lump, cause it just sad to me that it was like this, because none of the lady realized it. When I talked to my manager about it, cause I had the utmost respect for her and still do, she looked at me blankly for a moment, and then it dawned on her I was right. It was a realization that she grew accustomed to being blinded when any other male in the company was being rude to her, cause she wanted to do well in the company and not make too many waves. She was strong through and put an end to that behavior right away. Happily, she was never that blinded again and remained strong until she left for another job. He also talked badly about the managers and other team leads behind their backs, just like Linda, and these are all people that spent hours and hours going over the same things with them, very calmly and nicely. He also tried to ignore what I told him to do. I had daily tasks for everyone, and he would always try to just choose what he wanted to do. I ended up putting all his favorite jobs out of his reach. By far the most frustrating person I've had to deal with. This is just a snapshot of what the two of them did in the 3 weeks. Funny thing was, they got fired before their official paperwork had been inputted into the company's system. They were from a temp agency, and it had even gotten them all in the system to have access to everything. It came in the next day, after they were fired, to finish the last of the setup, and was like, wait, what? They are fired. But we don't know what to actually do now. Apparently the firing caused them to have these two people halfway in our system, but they needed some personal info to finish it out. But since they were fired, the temp agency was going to take forever to get us that info, and the setup ticket was going to just sit or something. It at the time did things weirdly. Late to the party, but this was when I worked part-time at McDonald's. It was a Sunday and my manager told me a new guy was coming in for his first day, so I would be his trainer starting at the cash registers. I was only there for barely a month, so it felt really good. I had made a decent enough impression to already have the responsibility of training something. Lunch rush was an hour away when he came in, and I immediately showed him the ropes in a positive way to help ease him in before we get too busy. He told me he worked at the Domino's just across the street, talked about all the work experience he had and how he was working multiple jobs and such. Awesome. Sounds like this will be a smooth ride. It wasn't. Around 10 minutes into the lunch rush and lines were already forming on both his and my registers. I reassure him that if he gets confused, just ask me or send it all my way. Then, right in the middle of an order I was taking, a family from the other line grabs my attention. Yes, sir, how can I help you? UHH. He just left. Excuse me. I was making my order and he just left. Bewildered, I turn and sure enough he was gone. I was so preoccupied with my long line of customers I didn't even notice. I scanned the lobby and he had completely vanished from the building. Next thing I know, I have to explain to my manager why our time was awful because his new hire just left. Later on I found out how things went down for him. Our GM himself called up the Domino's to let them know everything that just happened. I'm confident enough to say he went from juggling 2 jobs to just jobless that day. TLDR. New hire I'm training ups and leaves during lunch rush without a word on his first day. Made me feel bad.